Hi, can everyone hear me? It's a weird sound in here. You can't hear yourself, but you just assume everyone else can hear you. Thank you so much for coming. It's an absolute pleasure. I want to start off with one fun question. How often do people lie on their CV? People are nodding a lot, a lot. So on a couple of surveys, I didn't just look at one, I looked at two or three. 21 to 35% of people lied about their education at some point on their CV. Not necessarily entirely inventing degrees, but you may be squeezing that B up to an A, or maybe a little bit more recent. Interestingly, 31 to 39% had lied about their experience. What's even more interesting is that 43% of the people who'd lied said it contributed directly to their success. Now, what are the most common lies? They're not hugely whoppers. Sometimes there is. It's the, rather than I coached someone, I line managed someone. Or I didn't get a C in my A-levels mathematics, I got an A in my A-levels mathematics. Little tweaks here and there to try and push us towards a successful job. And who do you think the sneakiest and most honest sectors are? Any guesses? No? Well, you'll be grateful to know that the most honest is medicine, the least dishonest among them. But the most dishonest is sales and marketing, so please take everything I say now with a pinch of salt. Even among angels, though, even among the most honest sector, the NHS, obviously one of them, there's very high-profile examples of people being dishonest about their background, their CV, to get jobs. And a lot of this has contributed to some interesting trends in background checking in general. And by background checking, I'm going to define that basically checking someone is who they say they are, that they haven't done anything wrong in their past, and they've done what they've said they've done. And there's a whole bunch of checks that contribute to that. Now, this is going up quite dramatically. So in 2022, we saw a huge jump in the number of organizations doing some form of background checks, from 60 to 78%, which is a massive jump. In the UK, the number of checks a year had gone from 4.3 million, to 6 million. And perhaps most interestingly, criminal checks, DBS checks in the UK have gone up 500% over the last 5 years. Now, we sadly have the same number of hospitals and schools, so this is being entirely driven by the private sector. So what is going on? Why are checks, background checking, increasing so quickly in terms of the volumes? And we're focusing on the UK, but actually you're seeing this across Europe and in APAC as well. Well, one of the reasons is you look, you find. There's a bit of a snowball effect. When you start doing background checks, you start finding discrepancies, so you start doing more background checks. So of businesses who do background checks, 53% of them say that they found something. Something has turned up that they wouldn't have otherwise caught. And as soon as they've started doing that a little bit, they're like, goodness, I better do some more checks. So there's a bit of a snowball effect on it. The more people do checks, the more they realize that people are a bit dishonest sometimes, and the more checks they end up doing. Secondly, our attitude to risk has completely changed. Deloitte puts risk management as the top 5 concern of executives across the FTSE 100. We used to all be a lot more laissez-faire. We've had a couple of bruising decades of crashes, crunches, scandals. It's just made businesses a bit more risk-averse in general. Thirdly, obviously, remote work. It's not that we could actually tell in face-to-face if someone had a criminal record or not, but we sort of felt like we could. And doing remote work has meant people are a bit more sort of keen to do some background checking. Fourth bit is legislation and regulation. Is everyone here vaguely aware how right to work changed about a year ago? Yeah, weary nods, traumatized nods. That's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a huge wave of legislation across the UK and Europe affecting different industries. We're all signing up to a lot of voluntary standards like BPSS or SOC 2 or different sort of data standards that means that we have to do more of this. And the final one is brand vulnerability. When we screw up now, it's very public. It's all over Twitter or X. It's made these problems a bit of a problem. I'm going to give a really dramatic example of a check we all do. Everyone here will do right to work checks. Has anyone here ever worked for Byron Berger? Excellent. That's really good. So, does anyone remember when Byron Berger basically signed its death warrant as a business through one big mistake? They were hiring lots of illegal immigrants to do lots of work in their kitchens. Now, if you knowingly hire people who do not have the right to work in the UK, there are not just huge fines, you can go to prison. It's a really big deal. So, obviously, the Home Office got wind of Byron Berger not having done its checks, hiring lots of people in its kitchens, and obviously went to the management with some sort of deal along the lines of, help us sort this out and we won't send you to jail. So, what did they do? They invited all of their people in who they didn't think had the right to work, telling them that they were going to teach them a new burger recipe. This was in Holborn. And then immigration officials swooped in and arrested the lot. In one foul swoop, by being reckless of their right to work, getting themselves into a situation where they had no choice, they destroyed their business. And when they went out of business, their brand was destroyed 3 or 4 years later. All over Twitter was not much sorrow for the loss of their great burgers. Instead, it was, you guys had it coming. How could you have done such a terrible thing? Now, that's a very dramatic example, but it sort of illustrates, I guess, some of the importance. And if it was just on right to work, you do make a mistake, it will be published here on the government website that you have been caught hiring people without the right to work or not having got your statutory excuse. I don't want to scare you. It's just that these screw-ups, well, you've already seen a couple of news articles. It's very, very public. You do not want to tell your boss that you're a part of this list at any point. And also the fines are huge as well. So all these huge trends increasing background checking are sort of colliding with some other things that we've got going on at the moment. Your teams are leaner, you have less money, you have more admin, you're expected to do more with less, you're expected to automate things. You'll basically have less of you and you're expected to do more admin, more checking, and it gets a bit difficult. So there's a lack of automation. We're also in a global world. We've been talking about right to work in the UK. The 194 other countries have their own legislation. That's true with criminal checks, financial checks, credit checks. If you're working in a couple of different countries and you're hiring people from 10 or so countries, you've got a degree of complexity that is very difficult to navigate. Candidate experience. We're all so concerned about giving candidates a great experience. And nothing is a more horrible experience than having to hand over 30 documents and then having to obviously then wait 3 weeks. They're stressed out, you're stressed out. It kind of undermines all your good work. I think the most interesting fact along all of this is on surveying HR and talent experts, only about 30% of people feel really confident about what these checks mean, what their responsibilities are, and how to do them. So for the session here today, I'm just going to explain 3, give a little bit of context, help you understand them, and then at the end, I'll talk a very, very little bit about Zinc and what the future looks like in this space. But I mostly want this to be something you can take something away from. So criminal checks, DBS in the UK. Can you put your hand up if you're really confident about the different sorts of criminal checks you can do on different people? Excellent. This won't be a waste of time then. So there are 4 different types of criminal check you can do in the UK, and you can only do them if you have the right to do them. So enhanced with barring, this is what you can do basically on staff who are looking after vulnerable people, looking after children, looking after the elderly, the disabled, and that is really the only sort of person who can have this kind of check. It's cleaners in schools, it's teachers, it's people with healthcare roles. It's quite complicated, it's reasonably expensive. If you're a care company or an education tech company, that's the sort of thing you'll be doing. Enhanced is a very random sub-selection of people. Taxi drivers, people who work for the Gambling Commission, and some government roles. Standard is a much more likely for some of you. That's directors at businesses bidding for public contracts. That's solicitors, legal people. But the one that will be relevant for most of you is the basic, which is just one that you can do on any member of staff. And this is what's driven most of the increase, because you can do this on anyone who's employed for you. In terms of what they cover, Basic just looks at unspent convictions. So if you commit a crime and you're convicted of it, that crime has sort of a time limit, and after that time limit has gone past, it's spent, and then you can't be found out from a basic check. Standard looks at spent convictions. Enhanced looks at police intelligence reports as well. And Enhanced with barring adds in these barring lists, which are to protect vulnerable children and adults. So what's driven this 500% increase? As I say, there's not many more hospitals, there's not many more carers. Like, why has this gone up so much? Again, it's this look you find. So 2% of basic criminal checks uncover something that the candidate hasn't disclosed. You start doing this a little bit, you start seeing things come up, you then start doing more of it. 5% of enhanced checks cover something. There's also a severe reputational and legal risk if you hire someone with a criminal record and then they commit a crime that's a bit like the one they did in your company. If you hire someone who committed a white-collar crime, they stole from their company, and then they steal from your company and you didn't do a check on them, it's a bit embarrassing for everyone. And you can see some really sort of, if you just want sort of horror stories, just Google criminal hired to do X job and you can find pages and pages of stuff all over the news. And the third is protecting your business. Most estimates put loss of business to fraud in the UK at 5%. And finally, more and more of you are signing up to requirements like SOC 2, GDPR-related accreditations that mean you have to do it. And these are the things that are driving that massive increase. Now, interestingly, 50% of employers wouldn't hire someone with a criminal record, but 27% of the UK working population has some sort of criminal record, which is incredibly high. It goes up to 37% if you look at men rather than women. Now, these are not all particularly serious. Some of it is the shoplifting you did when you were 17. Not I did, but I imagine some of you here. Others, of course, is very, very serious. When you look at the concerns of employers about why they won't hire people with criminal records, it's not all entirely reasonable. This is obviously a huge chunk of the working population. Most of us cannot afford to say absolutely no to anyone who's ever got some sort of criminal record. But the reasons people are cautious about it are quite interesting. 45% just assume the person is unreliable. 40% is worried about the reputation of the business. 36% think they might upset their colleagues, skills and capabilities, and 28% just don't know how to interact with them. They're just so awkward, they're just not willing to hire them. Now, this changes quite dramatically on terms of types of crime. So most people are actually willing to hire someone who's got a driving offence at some point in their past. Interestingly, 20% of people are still willing to hire someone who's got a serious sexual offence in their past, which is, I think, rather extraordinary. But it gives you a sort of sense. And every company should have a policy about what to do with people's criminal record. I would not for a second suggest that you shouldn't hire someone with a conviction. In fact, I think it's one of the best things you can possibly do, given the right circumstances. But everyone should have a policy for it. And most policies look something like this. We ensure that all those involved in the recruitment process have been suitably trained to identify and assess the relevance and the circumstance of the criminal record, to make sure that it's actually something that matters to the job, and you're not just getting in someone's way of moving on with their life for something that doesn't really matter very much. So a sort of tentative conclusion about why background checks have been increasing so much, or the criminal side of things, is knowing if someone has a criminal record and what it is probably a good idea from a risk perspective, from a brand perspective, arguably even from a moral perspective. You do not want to hire someone with a history of sexual harassment and put them in your team among your colleagues. However, what you do with that information is up for you. You should really think about your policies, think about actually who you hire and who you don't hire, and make sure you're not just being discriminatory, that there is actually a good reason not to give someone a shot after they may have made some mistakes in their past. And it's really complicated. So I've just talked about the DBS. There's 195 countries in the world. Every single country has different rules about what you can and can't check under what circumstances. And if someone is moving here to the UK from abroad or has lived in other countries, you probably need to do criminal checks on where they're living, not just where they're living now. So ask an expert. It is so complicated. It's not a problem if you don't have a full grasp of what you can and can't do in every circumstance. Just make sure you ask someone. So that's the whistle-stop tour of criminal checks. The second one is employment verification and references. Who does references on who they hire here? Excellent. Those who don't do it, is it mostly like a time thing? It's quite time-consuming? Yeah? So references are quite interesting. So there's a couple of different types of references. There's employment verification, which is just checking someone has worked where they've said they've worked, which is almost always a good idea. And then there's character references, which are actually sort of trying to get an insight into the character, the skills, and ability of someone. Now, this is a list of how predictive different types of assessment are at predicting if someone's going to be a good hire or not. It's Schmidt and Hunter. It's an old study, but it's quite a good one. Now, you can see reference checks are actually quite low down the list. They're not actually fantastic at spotting if someone's going to be good or not. I'm sure you wouldn't trust every colleague you've ever had to give a fair and accurate reference of you. Might be too generous or too mean. So why do people do them? Why do we do references? Well, a lot of companies have to do them for regulatory reasons. If you're FCA regulated, if you work in healthcare, there are certain requirements that you have to do them. But the biggest one is basically just to check people have said what they've said they've done, which I think is probably like the low bar that everyone should meet. If you hired someone on the basis of their experience and CV, you should probably check that actually reflects reality in some way. Slightly more nuanced, which is becoming more popular, is checking the scope of their responsibilities. It's that classic case of, I ran this project. Did you run it or did you work on it? I've been managing these people. Were you managing them or were you just doing a bit of informal coaching every now and then? People are very less likely to invent job histories. They're very, very likely to embellish them slightly or exaggerate them. People do still use them for ability to check how good the candidate is, and we'll talk about how to check skills and culture fit in a way that's a little bit more objective, a little bit up in the air. And of course, onboarding and management. One of the best reference questions I ever ask when hiring someone for my team or their previous manager is, what makes them happy? Like, how do they learn? That sort of thing. Just like little insights that can help sort of speed up that process. So, in terms of the questions that you can ask in order to sort of check the scope of someone's responsibilities vaguely reflected what they asked, these are some good ones. So hiring salespeople, which is what I do, did the candidates hit their targets consistently while they were working with you? Even very bad salespeople are very good at selling themselves, and their targets get bigger and bigger and bigger. Can you describe what their line management responsibilities were in the role? Could you describe what they were responsible for in their final role with you? It's not just checking they had that title that time. It's just a little bit of an insight. And it doesn't have to be in depth, but just to check there is a broad alignment between what they've said they were responsible for and what they did. Another way you can improve it is the same way we've improved interviewing. Who here has moved from unstructured interviewing in your organization to structured interviewing over the past few years? Yeah, quite a few of you. Exactly the same logic holds. Structured interviewing is a lot more predictive of who's going to be good than unstructured interviewing. There's a numerical score against it. We're asking the same questions of everyone. Exactly the same principle can be applied to reference questions. So in terms of best practice, and we've got a lot of data to support this, try to do multiple references on 2 to 3 people. Use structured questions, not sort of just fuzzy, were they good, were they not good. Use reference information generally as additive information, not as sort of a trapdoor. It should never be the determiner of whether someone gets a job or not. It should be to give you some insight. Make it as painless as possible. Automate it. We automate back, references. There are possibly even 1 or 2 other companies here who might do the same, I'm not sure. But we definitely do. You don't have to do this manually. It doesn't have to be as painful as it used to be. And ask the right questions. So in terms of skills, this is a good example of a good reference questions. How would you rate the candidate's SQL skills? Add a little bit of commentary. Not just were they good, how did you rate them, but just like an actual bit of insight into how they were rated by a couple of their colleagues. How would you rate this candidate's ability to motivate the team when things are tough? Make it structured. Approach it in the same way that you've all revamped your interviewing over the past couple of years. And then finally, right to work. It was a year ago. Who here's confident that their right to work has now been changed and is completely compliant and all sorted? Oh dear. Okay. So it's a little bit scary because it's a year on, and quite soon they're going to start collecting scalps. The period of grace is coming to an end. So I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour to kind of help you out. So Right to Work 101 in the UK. All UK employers are required to check by law that someone has the right to work in this country. You do not want to Byron Burger yourself. If you have knowingly or reasonable cause to expect, if you know that you're doing it, or people would assume they know you're doing it, it's up to 5 years in prison. It's quite serious. Even if you're doing it sort of accidentally, they've just tripled the fine, and it could be £60,000 a candidate. If you've done it to 20 or 30, starts to add up. You'll be on that horrible government website, and they won't allow you to sponsor visas anymore. So it's really quite serious that you get it right. And what you're looking for is your statutory excuse. It's basically your get out of jail free card, which allows you to sort of show that you've done everything that you're supposed to have done throughout the process. Now, to get your statutory excuse now, you need to check the documents in person right in front of someone. You can do it over video if they've sent their documents to you in the post. Do not do this. I've heard horror stories of passports going missing in transit. This is a really bad idea. The third option is to use an IDSP, an identity service provider. We're an IDSP, as one of the things we do. We do all sorts of background checks, and companies like Zinc can do background checks on your behalf, remotely, automatically, at a distance. I won't go into too much detail. The other option is if the candidate's not from the UK, is to use something called a share code. A share code is a 9-digit number they get from the Home Office that shows their visa information. And if you do not have that, well, even if you've done a share code, you're supposed to redo it yourself, even if someone at Zinc does it for you. Now, If you're using another route, like a birth certificate and a national insurance number, you've got to meet that person in person. And you've also got to do something called an imposter check. Even if you do it automatically and remotely, you do have to check that the person who turns up on day one was the person who filled it out, and not a relative or a friend or just some random person they met on the internet. In terms of the breakdown of what people are doing at the moment, about 21% of people are using share codes, 75% are using passport, and about 3.6% are using birth certificates. And that is it. That's a whistle-stop tour through 3 types of checks. Now, obviously, right to work, every single country has different rules, and there's about 10 or 11 different checks Zinc alone offers. So there's a lot to learn, and please do come over to our stand. Just to give a little bit of context, we've got about 500 customers. We're one of the best rated checking company in the world at the moment. We're integrated in lots of stuff, and we work in all 195 countries. So we can do right to work criminal checks in every country currently in the world. Everything's fully branded, optimized, uses a lot of AI and facial recognition to speed things up. And we've got the quickest current turnarounds on the market. I guess the most exciting is rather than 90 minutes of admin per candidate, it's just 1 to 3. Anyway, sorry, that's the sales pitch at the end, but it was an absolute pleasure. Very happy to answer any questions, and thank you for your attention.